Hi, I'm Mark from Coffee Break Languages, and I'm delighted to be back with another episode in our series all about helping you maximize your learning time with the help of our handy blueprint for language learning. Now, in the last episode, we talked about routine and how important routine is when it comes to language learning. We talked about things like sticking to the same time each time you do some language learning, so the same time each day. We also talked about building up a pattern of learning over the course of the week and fitting it around your life, making sure it fits with your life because otherwise you won't be able to keep it up. We talked about experimenting with times and getting to know what works for you. And with the help of Pierre Benoit, our Coffee Break French colleague, we talked about breaking up your learning and doing learning in multiple short sessions rather than in one long session over the course of the week. So that is all for routine, but today we're going to be talking about a different topic, and that is the topic of setting goals. I think setting goals is so important because it helps you achieve what you want to achieve. If you know what you want to learn and when you want to learn it by, then you are going to make better progress with your language learning. So let's take a look at the first piece of advice I have for you all about setting goals, and that is setting goals for your session of learning. Now, last time we talked about this idea of having multiple sessions during the week. So a session could be 15 minutes, a coffee break. Why not? So in your session, you know what you're going to be doing. Perhaps you're going to be listening to a podcast, or you're going to be working through a chapter in your textbook, or reading a chapter of a book, watching something on TV in the language you're learning. But if you can set a session goal, then you'll know what you're wanting to achieve in that specific session. And I would make it very practical, very achievable. So perhaps it is, if you're listening to a podcast, maybe it is writing down 4 of the phrases that you've heard in the podcast or learned in the podcast. If you are watching a TV show, perhaps you're going to write down 10 new words that you've not heard before and check them out and look them up in a dictionary or word reference or wherever. But these goals need to be achievable. They need to be doable for that particular session within your session, because otherwise it becomes more difficult to achieve the goals if it's not something that is doable within that session. So whatever session you've got planned, try to establish not just what you're going to do in the session, but what you're going to achieve and how you're going to achieve it. So again, thinking back to planning ahead, making sure that you've got your notebook beside you so that you can write down those words, or the app on your phone that you're going to use to take a note of these words that you're learning. So definitely focus on session goals. The next type of goal I would like you to think about is your weekly goals. What are you going to achieve this week in your language learning? I like to think of this on a Sunday evening. For me, Sunday evening is a time for getting ready for the week ahead, thinking about what's coming up in work, but also thinking about what's coming up in language learning for my week. So if I am doing if I've planned my sessions over the course of the week, then I'd like to think about, okay, am I going to have achieved this by the end of the week? For example, if I'm focusing on verbs, am I going to be learning perhaps 10 verbs by the end of the week? And of course, that can be made up with perhaps 2 verbs in each session. But the idea is, if I've got a goal for the complete week, then again, if it's achievable, then the chances are I will be more likely to achieve it. So as I'm thinking through the week that's coming up of language learning, then I can identify all the things that I'd like to achieve during this week. And again, they can be cumulative goals. Perhaps if we've set a single number for each session, we can add them together for our weekly goal. Or perhaps it's more about reaching the end of something. For example, if I'm working on doing some reading, then I may think that by the end of the week, I'd like to have finished the chapter in the book that I'm reading in the language, or perhaps watched 2 episodes of a show and taken the notes on the language that I'm hearing, the vocabulary that is used in the episode of the show. But it's all about setting these goals in a way that you can achieve them. So thinking about, firstly, session goals, secondly, weekly goals. And the third type of goal that I'd like you to think about is the longer term goal. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, the longer term goal could be thinking about perhaps a monthly goal. So what are you going to achieve in the course of the next month? Or it's perhaps longer term. So you could be thinking, okay, what am I going to be able to do in 6 months' time or a year's time? And when it comes to this, I'd really like you to think not just about the task that you'll be able to achieve, but I'd like you to imagine yourself having achieved that task. So let's imagine the situation where you're, for example, planning to be able to have a conversation with your colleague at work who perhaps speaks the language that you're learning at home, and you'd like to be able to have that conversation with them, ask them what they did at the weekend, understand all their answers, ask them how their family is, and so on. So that's what your target is. But what I'd like you to do is think about how you'll feel when you've achieved that target. Imagine yourself walking away from that conversation back to your desk or back to your room or whatever your work situation is, and having achieved that conversation, and how pleased you'll feel, how relieved you'll feel that the conversation has gone well. Or perhaps your target would be, in 2 months' time, I'd like to be able to order a whole meal in the language I'm learning in a restaurant. So don't just imagine thinking up all the words for the vocabulary, the food that you're going to be ordering or the drinks that you're going to be ordering. But think about when it's brought to you and it's correct, that the order is right. Because when that is brought to you and you can enjoy that food, you'll know that you've ordered the food in the language that you're learning. And imagine yourself eating that food and enjoying that food and being so proud of yourself for being able to order the whole thing in the language that you're learning. So these are our longer term goals. And as I say, they're goals that you can associate with perhaps 1 month, 2 months, 4 months, 8 months, a year, even longer than that. And always try to put yourself in that situation. Imagine what it will feel like when you've achieved that longer term goal. Okay, finally, what I'd like you to remember is that goals help routine. So we've talked already about planning and then sticking to that routine. But if you've set these goals, they will help you achieve your routine. They will help you stick to that routine because you know that you're ticking the goals off as you complete them. And just when I say ticking them off, I do mean that, because I think it's important not just to have a goal in your head and think up, I'd like to achieve that by that date. Write it down. Because if you write it down in your notebook or in an app, there's apps that you can use for storing goals and so on. If you write it down and then the act of ticking it off or drawing a line through it or tapping the tick button on your app, this will in itself help you to be more pleased about the way in which you've achieved that goal. It is the act of ticking it off is all the more rewarding. So a quick summary of what we've talked about today. We have talked about session goals. We've talked about weekly goals, we've talked about longer term goals, and we've also talked about how the goals that you're setting will help you stick to that routine. And of course, we've also mentioned the idea of writing these goals down so that you're able to tick them off and also look back at them. Because if you get to the end of your 6 months or whatever, and you've perhaps you've ordered that meal or you've had that conversation or you've finished that book or whatever it is, then you can look back through your goals and see that progress that you've made over the course of time. And that's extremely rewarding. I hope that this has been a useful video for you. I hope you've enjoyed this next stage in our language learning blueprint. If you have, please give it a like and let me know how you set goals in the comments. And of course, so that you don't miss our next video, make sure that you're subscribed to our channel and hit the little bell icon that appears when you subscribe, and that way you'll be notified whenever we post new content. For now, thank you for watching, of course, and as ever, happy coffee breaking.